This is Akashvani. In the weekly program Current Affairs, now we bring you a discussion on exploring government initiatives promoting vocal for local during festivals. The participants are Shubhamoy Bhattacharjee and A.K. Bhattacharya, economic analysts. The moderator is Anubha Rohatagi.
Today the country is celebrating Dhanteras, which marks the beginning of Diwali festivities. For weeks preceding this auspicious occasion, people all over the country have been thronging markets and buying things to decorate their houses, business establishments, for gifting and for investment. The festival season is a big occasion for manufacturers, businesses, small artisans to showcase their products and artifacts. Prime Minister Narendra Modi recently called upon people to be vocal for local by purchasing local goods on the occasion of festivals. And to discuss the significance of Vocal for Local initiative and its impact on businesses and economy, I am now joined by economic analyst A.K. Bhattacharya. Mr. Bhattacharya, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Mr. Bhattacharya, in the last few years, at the start of the festival season, we have seen that Indian markets have been flooded with imported products. However, things have begun to change and we are now seeing a perceptible shift on the ground with more Indian products appearing on the shelves. How important has been Prime Minister Narendra Modi's call to be vocal for local in bringing about this change?
Well, idea that the country should be producing more domestically for domestic consumption has definitely some merit in the sense that if more goods and services are produced within the country, which are consumed by Indians, is an idea that needs to be encouraged. But if you, as a slogan, vocal for local is a laudable idea, but this is only the outcome level. What we have to see is how vocal for local can actually be realized with the use of economic policies effectively to bring about higher domestic production, which can be more efficient and more effective in promoting domestic goods. Remember that the idea of buying local goods should not be at the cost of sacrificing consumers' choices, in the sense that the consumer should not compromise his or her choices while he goes in for local goods. In other words, that the local goods also need to be competitive in terms of costs and competitive in terms of quality. Now, that is also the function of economic policy that will encourage domestic industries to remain competitive and provide as many choices as possible to the consumers. While from a producer point of view, vocal for local is a good idea, but from a consumer point of view, vocal for local must be complemented with availability of options, availability of goods that are quality, that have a certain element of quality and which are price-wise competitive. So therefore, both ways, the idea of vocal for local must work to the advantage and the benefit of not only the producers, the Indian economy, but also for the consumers.
Mr. Bhattacharya, the Prime Minister has been an ardent advocate of India-made products and promoting local industries. Now, in what ways have the Make in India and Atmanirbhar campaigns influenced industrial policies to reduce dependence on imports and boost local production?
Well, the idea of Make in India is to encourage domestic industries to produce more goods within the country so that the huge domestic demand can be met. And one of the well-known policies, the incentive schemes that the government has introduced for Make in India is a production-linked incentive scheme. Now, PLI, as we all know, sets some benchmarks and provides some subsidies and incentives for those who invest in India to produce goods meant for domestic as well as export consumption. Now, that is Make in India initiative, which encourages domestic production within the country. But along with the PLI schemes, the production-linked incentive scheme, it will be important to bear in mind how domestic availability of components as well as raw materials are ensured so that the domestic producers are not inhibited or compromised on account of quality raw materials and quality components. So therefore, it is very important to recognize the importance of choices even for producers, because if a producer does not have access to competitive the products for which can act as raw materials and components for its goods, it will be difficult for the domestic producers, even under PLI scheme, to produce more and compete with the best in the world. So therefore, the tariff policies are immense importance if you want schemes like Make in India or the Production Linked Incentive schemes to succeed in ensuring that industry does well in the country.
At this point, let me introduce our second panelist, Shubhmoy Bhattacharjee, to the program. Shubhmoy, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Shubhmoy, we just heard Mr. Bhattacharya has been talking about the PLI scheme and what role it is playing in promoting the vocal for local or local products in India. So to take this question further, at the moment there are about 14 sectors which are being covered under this scheme. Are there any specific sectors or industries where the government sees the potential for significant import substitution? And what more, in your opinion, needs to be done?
Well, I was listening to Mr. Bhattacharya very carefully and I couldn't agree more with, and I would definitely agree that while there is a lot of scope for bringing more sectors in the production linked incentive, the first thing that needs to be thought through is the value chain complete within the domestic economy itself for production, for the final product of quality to reach the consumers? Or do we need to think that through a bit more carefully? And that, I think, is something that actually will help India. Because instead, while we are saying that we don't want to import finished goods, and that's a good point, let's not push the other direction that we'll reduce imports of even raw materials or intermediate products to entirely negligible amounts, which is frankly impossible to even sustain or even think of in a connected world. And frankly, India will not be cost competitive in this world. I mean, for instance, to take an example, for instance, in a neighboring Bangladesh, they produce ready-made garments. Now, it's absurd to think that Bangladesh uses everything in those garment value chain with just sourcing them within Bangladesh. Yet they are doing very well, and now they've upstaged China. Now, that is a significant example for us to mull over. Our textile industry, for instance, despite all the support that has been given over the decades, hasn't really been able to create that sort of a value addition proposition which was necessary. So there is a lot of nuancing that needs to be thought of in the vocal for local. However, having said that, internationally I would say that if you look at the trend of what is happening in most countries across the world and led even by USA, the idea of economic nationalism is now the dominant trend of thought. Lots of factors have gone into it, which Mr. Bhattacharya was referring to, and those need to be understood, that from where India is also coming in from. If countries decide that they need for their development to insource their production process, then obviously it is quite a different paradigm from the last 40 years of economic policy, which was entirely one of globalization unhindered. So yes, there are more sectors that can come in, that is of course a question of choices within the economy, and that is where a significant point needs to be made, that practically every sector can create a position, a thought processing that we are capable, give us the support that's needed. But is it necessary for the government to keep on expanding the basket, or is it necessary at some stage to say, no, what we are trying to create is a competitive environment, a domestically competitive environment where companies compete among themselves? It is not a paradigm for saying that companies will be covered from competition, because when you cover from international competition, you also say that they will be covered from domestic competition. And then all sorts of issues come into the production process. The beneficiary then definitely is not the end consumer, but the company. And we have got sufficient amount of evidence from the orders passed by the Competition Commission of India, where we have seen evidences of mispricing in several sectors within the economy. These were not competition from abroad, but competition from within the economy. So therefore, vocal for local, it's a policy which is quite in tune with what's happening internationally, but it since it allows or asks the government to bring in a far larger amount of policy detailing, it needs to be worked through very carefully.
Mr. Bhattacharya, Shubmoy has been talking about, few things that have struck me while he was speaking, economic nationalism, supply chain. And he also mentioned while talking about the PLI scheme that it's not necessary to increase the basket, though it's a welcome step. But what is more important is to create a competitive environment. So in this context, can you provide some insights into, what kind of a role does reforms, rational tax systems, clear laws, ease of doing business, and human resource development and strengthening financial systems play?
Yes, I think you have touched upon a very important issue which Mr. Bhattacharya has also referred to. And what I would say is that the core issue in making a success of the idea of vocal for local is to make sure that the Indian economy remains competitive. Now, how do you make sure that the Indian economy remains competitive even while demanding for more local goods? Now, as I said, that the consumer's choices cannot be compromised, just as the producer's choices cannot be compromised. So what we need to focus on is certainly, we have done a lot of tax reforms. GST was a very good idea when one country, one tax idea was introduced. So now that definitely eased the processes of doing business. Then there was the question of how do you make sure that the financial intermediation is getting better and more competitive. But most important thing is the infrastructure sector. And when I say the infrastructure sector, it is not just a question of the economic infrastructure like airports, roads, and bridges, but also the social infrastructure of water, of education, of health. Because if you want to encourage Indian industry to take a step forward in meeting the domestic demand while facing competition and while remaining competitive, then you must also provide those conditions which are as good, if not better, than what obtains elsewhere. So demand for local must come along with a dramatic improvement in domestic infrastructure, domestic conditions of ease of doing business. All those factors are very important. And an equally important element in the idea of encouraging local goods for local consumption would be to ensure that the various laws, whether they are financial laws or whether they are business laws, they need to be improved and simplified. A lot of ground has been covered in the last few years, but I think a lot more attention also needs to be paid to make sure that the idea of promoting local goods is that the goal is achieved without compromising on the choices of the consumers and the producers. And another point I would like to add here is the reference that Mr. Bhattacharya made to supply chains. I think it's important to recognize how the global economies have changed and evolved. While there is economic nationalism at one level, there is also an increasing prominence and use of global supply chains in producing any goods. So therefore, like there was a reference was made to Bangladesh, that whatever you produce in one area is not really an outcome or output emerging out of products and services available in the same area. There are inputs and outputs coming from different parts of the world. So you need to be plugged into a supply chain ecosystem. And for that, you need to have overall tariff structure and overall economic policies that do not stifle choices. On the contrary, they encourage choices. And through those choices, if industry can remain competitive and become more competitive, then I would say the idea of vocal for local will actually bear the fruit for both the Indian consumers as well as for the Indian economy in general.
Shubmoy, one segment which has been particularly badly affected by the onslaught of imported goods, particularly Chinese goods, which we see a lot of Chinese goods during this festival season, has been the micro, small and medium enterprises, or the MSMEs, which include, of course, the rural artisans as well. So how is the government extending a helping hand to them? I mean, do you think schemes like one district, one product are a big step in extending a helping hand to the MSMEs and small artisans?
Actually, I would rather think that's a good idea, because one of the things that's happening with, or rather has happened with the micro small enterprises, is that their scale economies have really never been understood well. And by definition, a micro enterprise works at a scale which, unless you go down to that level, you cannot understand what is the problem afflicting that person. What is a slight change in cost which can cripple that enterprise entirely out of the business? So there are lots. I would say that if policy administration says, look, I really can't go down to that granular level, I would rather look at it as a district-wise intervention of one product, and there I would try to bring in the necessary support. I would say that's actually a rather good idea, because we can understand that policy administration cannot really make it that fine an intervention. So I'm all for that, and I think if it is done well, it'll be a very, very useful intervention. And as I said, this is something that will obviously need to be understood across every district, across every, the moment you pick a winner in a district, then that means that there would be some losers in the district. And in that case, those losers need to be compensated. Those losers who are producing some other product might need to be shifted out or given a district identity may not necessarily be a geographical district identity. It might actually be a contiguity identity, in which case you bring in that sort of ratified idea. That sort of a nuanced idea in terms of which product will work in any particular district. This becomes complicated. Let me put it very simply. For instance, economies, we talk about what works and what doesn't work. Micro enterprises or small enterprises are not objects of curiosity. They should be objects of satisfying daily needs. They should be producing products which have already come into the market, and they can further extend those, and they produce the same products. To tell that the micro enterprise should actually be bringing in new product, should be bringing innovation, can actually be a dangerous idea, because they, frankly speaking, are at that position where any risk very difficult. So it is something that requires, again, as I said, one of the areas where, in fact, this vocal for local I have not yet found a resonance, and I think the government is already aware of it and is really pushing on, is at the panchayat and at the municipal level. The panchayats and the municipality administrations need to understand this thing. Most of the time you find, and if you talk, and these are big entities now, they've got good money, but if you talk to them, they talk only about very macro ideas of, keeping safety, keeping drainage clear, lighting, sanitation, but they do not think of themselves as entities which need to promote industries, enterprise, but yet they are the ones who are in direct contact with the people. And if they are not doing it, then obviously the state government and obviously the central government is impossible to think of it. It is they who need to be set very clear targets. How much have you been able to create, say, this one district, one product as your target in the next 6 months, in the next 12 months, and those should be enforced in their performance appraisals. I see no reason why municipal administration officials or panchayat officials should not be responsible and should not be made accountable for having encouraged industry in a very clear, measurable, monitorable way. And I think that's the missing link that is often hurting these enterprises.
And what you're talking about, the Panchayati Raj, the panchayats at the micro level, the municipal corporations, that would also make them, financially viable, because that's one thing, whether it is a panchayat, whether it is a municipal corporation, they are forever, struggling for finances. And when they encourage an industry, when they become part of an industry, that would also make them financially viable. And again, what the whole idea of vocal for local is to encourage employment. That would also generate employment.
Absolutely, but I don't think that they've got a financial crunch, almost thanks to the successive finance commissions. I study them fairly carefully, and I don't find panchayats or municipalities really gasping for money. Their problem is in terms of what the people are gasping for, that they are not providing the support of the sort that they needed. They do some days, they do some events, but they do not put their head down to understand what is it necessary to make micro enterprises work. And I think that's a very missing gap there.
Mr. Bhattacharya, while we're talking about vocal for local, another word has been now added to it, which is global. So how does the promotion of vocal for local fit into this local for global overall strategy of making Indian products competitive on a global scale?
This is exactly the point I was trying to make at the start of our discussion. But before I come to that point, let me say a few words about this excellent thought on micro enterprises. It's very important that micro enterprises must receive the kind of importance that they deserve in the idea of achieving vocal for local, because micro enterprises are essentially units that are set up in villages and panchayats. And as you would know, that 96% of our total enterprises in this country are all in the unorganized sector, and out of them, the bulk of them are micro enterprises. And they also provide a lot of jobs. So it's very important that if you can weave the idea of micro enterprises into the concept of vocal for local, it will help. But what probably will not help, if you create incentives in a manner that these micro enterprises continue to remain micro enterprises and they are not encouraged to grow and graduate into levels of activity that they need to sustain themselves for. There is a tendency in India, we have seen in the past many years, that micro enterprises do not want to grow into a medium enterprise or a small enterprise even, because they're afraid that one, they will not be able to face the winds of competition, and then they will lose some of the incentives that they used to enjoy as a micro enterprise. So I think the economic policy structure, the government's policy structure should be such that micro enterprises are encouraged to grow into small or medium enterprises, and yet they get a modicum of support so that this graduation and transition becomes easier, so that we don't see the unfortunate prospect of micro enterprises remain micro enterprises and they don't grow, become part of a larger ecosystem. Now, this is connected with your thought of how do you make vocal for local that also becomes relevant for global. Now, unless you create a competitive structure in which micro enterprises is encouraged to become small and medium and medium to large, then how do you make sure that the local product that you produce and they are also relevant for global, which will help you in two things. One, making sure that the domestic demand is met, and second, you can actually help earn some foreign exchange for the country through your exports. Now, this, to my mind, is very critical. Without having an ecosystem in which the small becomes large and the large becomes larger, and they produce goods and services without having the associated problems of lack of quality or being very expensive. Therefore, the choices for consumers, whether it is in the country or globally, doesn't get diminished. So therefore, that's a very, very important element in our entire idea of vocal for local and local for global.
Shubhoy, whether it is vocal for local or Make in India or even Atmanirbhar Bharat, now these slogans and schemes will work and yield results only if people decide to adopt them in their day-to-day lives. And luckily, we are seeing this change. In fact, in October, if I'm not wrong, the sale of Khadi and village industries products witnessed record sales in Delhi, to give just one example. So what do you think has brought about this change in people's mindsets?
Yes, it's a point. Let me just turn to a sector which is often not talked about, our films. For quite some time, the Hindi film industry in India was taking a big battering, and it was taking a battering from competition abroad. But more so, its competition came from our very talented filmmakers from down south.
Yes.
And you can see what happened. Now, this is what exactly it's not that the people were gearing up to watch only English films from there. Yes, there was a lot of interest in South Korean pop. There was a lot of interest in Japanese plays and all that. But there was a larger population which we actually wanted good entertainment, and the Hindi film industry wasn't providing it for whatever reasons. And they gravitated south. And South came up with such wonderful products. Now, it's within India. It's vocal for local. And look at what happened. Looking at the change, looking at the scale which those films came up with, looking at this, all sorts of elements that they brought in, the Hindi film industry has adapted. and it has responded to competition. So I don't think people have been very different. They have always liked a good product when they can see one. And if within the country, if we can provide a good product, people will go to it. So I wouldn't say that the people don't know how to champion a local product. They need to be given a champion product, as Mr. Bhattacharya was talking about, that you got to have a good quality product. And look at the change that has been brought about in Indian film industry, in the entire entertainment industry. It has really jumped up with such a profusion of wonderful content that's coming from within India. So I think there is enough evidence from within India that we can use it if we are able to look at it, with open mind. We're looking at the evidence of what works, which doesn't. Again, that small industries that we talked about, absolutely right. They need the support. Don't try to support too much of the big industries. They can take care. Let them compete. We are asking the states to compete. We're talking of cooperative federalism. So states should compete with each other. Why shouldn't the companies compete with each other? I don't see any reason why competition should be a bad word. So there is enough space and more for us to get very good results from all around us within India.
An apt analogy, as with movies, so with local products. And a very last question to both of you. I would like you to, Mr. Bhattacharya, to take this first. What challenges do you foresee in the successful implementation of Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan and Vocal for Local movement? Moving on.
The first big challenge, and I would say that this is very important, is to make sure that policies ensure that competition and quality, these are the two touchstones on which growth will prosper. So unless the policies do not encourage competition, and unless the policies do not encourage quality products, and therefore they become price sensitive, so therefore policies must make sure that they are qualitatively better priced and qualitatively they can face competition. So these would be the very, very important elements in making a success of the idea of vocal for local.
Shubmoy.
Yes, I couldn't agree even more. I mean, this is absolutely necessary. Vocal for local means massive reforms. Reforms of land, reforms of labor, reforms of capital. We need very thoroughgoing reforms. There have been lots done, but plenty work has not yet been done. And of late, the slogans seem to be substituting for hard work on the ground in terms of, pushing for reforms in key areas where there are inefficiencies. Those need to be cut through. If the country has to be competitive, the policymakers must show the willingness and the push to make reforms so that the people can work harder to deliver. So hard reforms are very necessary. Those must be pushed through. With the slogan of vocal for local, it shouldn't be difficult. But even if it is, this is where if you want to go, we have to push for competition, and which means basically taking on the reform mindset very strongly.
Mr. A.K. Bhattacharya, Shubmoy Bhattacharya, thank you so much for coming to this program and for this informative discussion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You were listening to a discussion on exploring government initiatives promoting vocal for local during festivals. The participants were Shubmoy Bhattacharya and A.K. Bhattacharya, economic analysts. The moderator was Anubha Rohatogi. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on a mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or WhatsApp on 9289094044.